Welcome to the Hunt Backcountry Podcast. This is episode number 404, and today we're talking all about archery. So Steve and myself have both separately been very, very deep into archery, and in some ways we actually met through archery more than a decade ago. Steve used to own a bow shop and tune a bunch of bows. I was self-taught and did my own bow tuning and work and setup and shot a ton of bows and love archery and bow hunting. But we haven't stayed as up to date in the last handful of years on all the new gear, new equipment, new techniques, etc. And so it's been something on our radar to talk with someone who's more current, more informed, who has stayed more up to date on all of those things. And that's what we're doing today with Kellen Morgan. Kellen has a YouTube channel called Inside Out Precision with some great helpful archery content there. And he's also a hunter, a shooter, and a professional bow tech. So he gets to handle all kinds of bows and work with customers, and is just very knowledgeable and up to date on all things archery. And we just wanted to talk with him to kind of get a feel for where things are at currently with the world of archery and bow hunting from a kind of technical and gear related perspective. So this is a wide-ranging conversation. I hope you enjoy it. There's so much in here on bows and accessories, shooting technique, releases, and just a whole lot more. So again, very wide-ranging, kind of something to pull for everyone, whether you're a new bow hunter or a more experienced bow hunter who maybe, like myself and like Steve, isn't necessarily up to date on all the latest and greatest. Before we dive into that, just want to remind you guys that here in the month of June 2023, we are doing a giveaway with our friends from Sig Sauer. They're giving away a pair of Zulu 6 image stabilizing binoculars. And all you need to do to enter is go to exomountaingear.com/podcast and look for that entry form. It'll take you just a minute to do that. Hit pause and do that right now. Then come back. Here's this conversation with Kellen Morgan. Well, Kellen, welcome to the podcast, man. I'm excited to have you join us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've been following you guys for a long time and very familiar with all your gear and what you're doing in the industry. So
Cool.
Honored to be on here.
Yeah, I was telling you that I didn't know you by name in terms of, Kellen. But when I started reaching out to some guys like, hey, who's up to date on archery and doing cool stuff and all that, like your name popped up. And then I realized, I've seen some of your videos and stuff like that. But before I dive into all of that, what would be an introduction for listeners who, just to provide some context for who you are?
Yeah. So my name is Kellen Morgan. I guess most people would, say they quote know me from my YouTube channel. It's not a big hunting channel or anything like that. It's called Inside Out Precision, and really, I started it just to get information about whether it's gear, shooting form, tech tips, all that sort of stuff, but have it be very unbiased. I kind of noticed there was a spot in the market that was kind of being missed for unbiased information. Whereas I understand a lot of these guys with channels have sponsors. They need to, their sponsors hold their feet to the fire in terms of what they can promote and what they can't. I just wanted to be able to make a channel that was like, hey, if this bow, here's what this bow can do. I'm not saying it's good, bad, or indifferent, but, here are the specs. Here's the technical aspects of it. Go shoot it and see if it's for you. So that's been going on for the last 4 years now. Prior to that, I've been in archery since I was 12 and I'm 35 now. I was kind of mentored by Wayne Endicott at the Bow Rack, among a lot of other guys there that I met at, the shooting leagues and stuff like that. But back in 2015, I actually started working for Wayne at the Bow Rack full time. And that really, really helped give me a platform. I learned a ton of knowledge about bows and arrows, and Wayne is an absolute guru with that sort of stuff. But on top of that, it just gave me really access to a lot of good equipment, knowledgeable people, and so on and so forth. And so, that's been the best job, favorite job, I've had up and until this recent move. And, those guys are like family to me. And I just feel really fortunate to have been, blessed with great mentors and a path forward that I think is the right way. So yeah.
Is your YouTube channel entirely devoted to archery?
It is. Yep. Sometimes on my Instagram, I do a lot of waterfowl hunting, and sometimes I get a little carried away posting pictures of bird piles. But generally, it is archery hunting or archery just in general. Yeah.
Is what got you hooked on archery? Was it the competition side? Was it hunting? Was it a mix of both?
Initially, it was the hunting. I started deer hunting with my dad and some of his friends when I think I shot my first buck when I was 10. And so when I was 10 and 11, both those years, my dad would take me out of school for a week. We'd head over east. I'd shoot a buck opening morning, and then I'd have to go back to school. And I was like, let's make this a little more difficult. I want that full week off. Also, just growing up watching, I always watched TNN Outdoors and all this stuff. And bow hunting looked so cool, but I had no idea that it was even an option for kids, because there wasn't very much equipment back then that would fit a 12-year-old kid. And B, just never really saw it on TV. And then there was actually, so in eighth grade, the first day of school, everybody would bring in, they call it a brown bag speech. And it was kind of like a older kid show and tell, basically. So you brought in things that, represented you and your family and whatever. And this kid had the fletched end of an arrow, and was talking about how he and his dad bow hunt together. And I was like, what? I didn't know kids could bow hunt. So I, went to the bow rack for the first time, met Wayne there. Ended up getting a Hoyt MT Sport for Christmas that year, and just kind of got obsessed with it. My goal is I wanted to shoot a turkey first. So I wanted to get good enough to shoot a turkey in the head. And I pretty much just ended up spending, from eighth grade till my junior, senior year of high school, I spent almost every day after school at the bow rack, just shooting and, practicing. And then it went down, my freshman years when I really started getting into the competitive side of things, and that kind of took over my life for a lot of years. But yeah, it was one of those sports where it just made sense to me. I was always competitive, but growing up, I was always kind of the uncoordinated, I grew faster than my coordination would allow to keep up with. So, when it came to organized team sports, I was always a bench warmer. But with archery, it kind of gave me an avenue to be really competitive, not only with myself, but then in a tournament setting. And so for me, it was just kind of the perfect outlet.
Yeah, that's cool, man. My background with archery was very self-taught, right? And I just started, and I didn't know anybody who shot a bow or bow hunted personally. And, I started with a Cabela's kit bow and just figured stuff out over time and upgraded and got a press and wanted to take the deep dive, and it was all self-taught. So I'm sure I had a lot of gaps and misconceptions, but man, I just went off the deep end. And there is something just so cool about, as simple as a bow and arrow can be, it can, obviously, as people know, it can be incredibly complex. You can make it as complicated as you want, right? And I just, for a handful of years, absolutely loved learning everything that I could about it. And it's so fun to geek out on, for sure. And then I would say I've done the kind of the same thing with rifles over the last 5+ years, where it's I'd always shot a rifle, but I wasn't all the ins and outs and reloading and all the geekery and the whole rabbit hole. And I've done that. And it's funny, now that I've done that with rifles, it makes me look back at that same process I had with bow and arrow, and I look at it differently because, just perspective, right? And I think, you can speak to it too, Steve, but for both of us, it was we've nerded out, and then, but the last handful of years, we've also not stayed fully up to date. And part of what we wanted to do is just talk with you, about some of the things you're seeing, whether it's trends, cool new gear, what matters, what doesn't. So yeah, this is going to be definitely a very wide ranging conversation. But for you, Steve, where do you what comes to mind immediately?
Yeah, just the same backstory as you, right? I just 18 was when I heavily got into, basically bought my first bow and then just dove headfirst into archery for quite a few years. I mean, the reason we're doing this podcast is because I started working on bows for people out of my garage, and that turned into building SNS Archery, and then turned into Exo Mountain Gear. And so I was just full on archery forever and ever and ever. And about, I don't know, at some point I just felt like I got tapped out on like what I could learn. I don't know, just kind of like, okay, I'm probably there is a whole nother level you could get to, right? As far as your shooting abilities, but then rifles kicked over, and that was 5 years ago. And since then I haven't kept up other than just to kind of check in on things. And I just don't see, I'm not seeing like equipment, anything significantly changed. I think what I was shooting in 2010, I could easily grab and be as competitive, as proficient as anything I could buy off the shelf now. And I think that's where I'm curious if there's new techniques for tuning. I'm not seeing any new equipment. Like, I mean, I don't think bows have, they're continually getting a little bit more efficient, but you could also hand somebody a 2010 bow and, that's going to shoot fantastic. So, I'm curious, Kellen, from your perspective, what, I guess how, what's your timeline here? How long ago were you working for the bow rack and just getting into all this stuff?
Yeah. So in terms of, officially working on bows like as a tech, so 2015 is when I started, but okay. I would have to agree with you on the equipment side of things, especially in the bow area specifically. If you look, and really especially in the last like 5 or 6 years, I mean, if you look at like a Matthews, Halon 32, which was new in I think 2015 or 16, that bow and the Phase 433 that just came out, I mean, very, very similar bows. I don't think, if you weren't accurate with the Halon, you're not going to be accurate with the Phase 4. I think the industry as a whole has kind of plateaued in terms of how fast and efficient we can make a bow with the technology we have available to us. Somebody's going to crack the code on, how to get a bow to shoot a legitimate 330 feet a second with a hunting arrow at 29 inches and 70 pounds. But nobody's done it yet. So what you're seeing a lot of is it's little fit and finish things. Obviously you're seeing the trend right now with like Hoyt and Matthews and PSE and all these companies are going to kind of the integrated system. So whether it be a Picatinny sight or, the dovetail that mounts through the riser on Matthews, like the bridge lock, the rests that sit directly behind the riser, which allows you to suck your quiver up closer to the bow. It's things that make shooting a little more comfortable, I think. But in terms of the guts of the bow, cam systems have not changed a lot in the last 10 years. Obviously there are little things that companies do, like Matthews going to the switch weight cam. That's pretty cool, being able to make your bow a 60 to 75 pound peak weight. It's nice from a technician standpoint, because if I have, a gal or a teenager that comes in and, they're an adult, or they're adult, if it's a teenager, but they're, 6 feet tall and have a long draw length, but they can't pull 55 pounds yet, we can put the 60-pound mods and back that bow down to like 30 or 35 pounds and let them have high-end equipment that they can grow with, versus buying, a $400 or $500 setup, and then a year later having to get rid of that and, jump into a band setup. I'm
not aware of that they did that. That's cool. So that's just changing, basically the size of the cam. So
it's crazy how they do it. It's in the module. So draw, like Matthews, they have every draw length is a different bolt-on module. So the base cam stays the same, but you change the module, and the shape of that module, the way it pushes on the cables, will actually change the peak weight. So you can have, it's the same cam, and then that, so let's say it's a 29.5-inch module. That would be, you can get that module in a 75, a 70, a 65, or 60 pound peak weight, and then back the bow down from there. Whereas pretty much every other company, as you probably are well aware, the limb is what determines your peak weight. So if you want a 75-pound bow, generally you got to get an 80-pound bow and back it down to 75.
Like from an engineering standpoint, what's happening is the limb deflecting less, or does the axle to axle actually just grow with the new mod on there?
Yeah, it's the way that the module presses on the limbs, which then increases the amount of pressure being put on the limb. The way that I've explained it, which then obviously increases or decreases your the deflection and the peak weight. So
yeah,
pretty crazy. Cool. Yeah. In terms of accessories, I think have come a long way. Just in terms of the quality of the stuff being used. I mean, I remember with releases back in the day, at least with the handheld releases that we'd shoot for target, I mean, you'd get about 10,000 shots out of I had, an old Carter back in the day, and then a little hook and sear in there. It was stainless steel, but it wasn't a hardened stainless. And over time, it would get so sloppy to the point where there's just so much travel. It was kind of anybody's guess as to when it was actually going to fire, which, depending on who you talk to, may be a good or a bad thing. But I think you're right that if you were, like you said, you can pull a bow off the shelf from 2010 or 12, especially in the target side of things. I mean, there just hasn't been that much change.
Yeah.
But every year's a little bit, like in any industry, a little change. Eventually somebody's going to crack the code, and there's going to be kind of that next jump or that next revolution or evolution in the sport. So, yeah, it's kind of like iPhones. There's not that big a difference between a 6 and a 12, but
right,
yeah. Bows got quieter, cameras get better. That's about it. In terms of marketing.
That is one thing. A lot of marketing. I mean, bows it's insane how quiet and smooth they are. Now, in my opinion, this might be an unpopular opinion, that's probably the last thing that's going to make you more accurate. For a hunting scenario, I understand you want quiet. There's still not a bow that makes zero noise, right? So if you draw back and that buck or bull sees you draw and they're aware something's there, they're still going to hear a quiet bow just like they'd hear a loud bow. So like I said, there's nothing that's not going to make zero noise yet. And then the smooth aspect, I think it's nice, especially for newer shooters. A really violent shot kind of promotes target panic because it's almost like the recoil on a rifle where they're expecting this big, extravagant, just bam when the bow goes off. So having kind of smoother, quieter shot, I think makes it a little easier for especially newer shooters to kind of learn how to, execute a shot properly and not worry about this violent reaction when the trigger releases. But in terms of inherent accuracy, I mean, target bows are neither smooth nor quiet, and they're incredibly accurate. So, there's a lot of things that are kind of market driven or marketing driven that at the end of the day, in my opinion, don't really equate to more accuracy. But that's what the public likes to hear. So,
yeah, I think that's what's driven me nuts about the archery industry is especially you just looked right at the bow companies. Every year they are expected, and I think it's their own, they shot themselves in the foot, but they're expected to come out with the latest and greatest bow.
Yeah.
And it's just constant, every, by October, November, Hoyt and Matthews are releasing their new bow for the next year already. And you just bought your brand new bow that you just got it in July and just started shooting for hunting season. And now you're being told that your bow's, insufficient. And here's the new latest, greatest, when in the reality that, I mean, certainly bow companies are, because they're pushing so hard, there's sometimes a new bow is not, it's worse than the old one. It might have tuning issues or, construction issues. It might be, more vibration. Certainly they kind of go back and forth. And like you said, over 10 years, 15 years, sure, little increments, but it's not a guarantee that just because it's new it's better. And that just drives me nuts, right? It's just marketing BS.
It is. If you're going to spend the time and the money to roll out a new bow, it's make it substantially different and better.
Yeah. Right.
I will say, I think it's this year probably more than any I can remember. I think all the big companies, so at the shop, we sell Bowtech, PSE, Matthews, Hoyt. We used to have Prime in there. At the bow rack, they sold Prime. All those companies this year, I think, are probably building the best bow they have in a long time. Whereas a lot of years are pretty clear, outliers in that really are ahead of everybody else. And this year, it's we're setting up a ton of bows right now for guys. And I tell them, there's really nothing inherently better this year from one brand to the other. They're all incredibly good quality. They tune well, they're smooth, they're quiet. check all the boxes. It's just going to be which one is more comfortable to you. It's like when you're trying on boots, if you got a Kenetrek, a Crispy, and a Hanwag all right there, they're all great boots, but one might give you blisters and one is going to be comfortable. No knock on the quality of the boot that gives you blisters. It's just for you, it may not be right. Mm-hmm. But I agree with you with the the new thing. I mean, you look at like Hoyt and Matthews this year, and this is no shade on them because I shoot a Matthews. But when they were like kind of hyping us up for the new bow, they said, "Oh, we're revolutionizing the industry. Nobody's going to be able to figure out how we did it." And I thought that they had cracked the code, like I was talking about earlier. Finally developed a cam system that would shoot a legitimately, 320, 330 feet a second with just average, specs. And then they're like, we put rubber between the limbs. Like, what? Not revolution. Pretty sure limb safe been doing that since 97.
Yeah.
But you got to do something. Yeah, it was such a successful platform last year that they just kind of, improved it a little bit in terms of noise and vibration. But that's also, the improvements they made are a very, say, small percentage of an already very small number. So how tangible that is to the shooter or not that's up to the individual to decide. But again, no shade on Matthews. I don't want to get in trouble for saying that.
No, but it's the reality. I mean, it's what's happening, right? Like you're just, yeah. Is there any bow companies not coming out with a new flagship bow every year? I know Hoyt's kind of had a couple years of like maybe COVID stuff where they like an RX 7 or 5 was for 2 years. Yeah. With the carbon bows, I think it was a production side of things. They got so behind when they launched the RX 7 originally. I mean, I was still at the bow rack at that time, and we had guys that would put them on order before we even got them in the shop. Like Hoyt would announce them, they would call them and say, "Hey, I want the first buckskin color one that comes in," and they'd get it 5 months later. And I know that was a supply chain issue. They didn't have enough workers, all that. I mean, Hoyt was, they had help wanted ads out for months trying to get people in there building bows. It is, I think, the best carbon bow that they have ever produced. So I'm not really sure where they go from there. It is, it's a great, great bow. And I think they just wanted to make sure that, okay, there's probably still people in November waiting on bows that they ordered in, July. So they kind of make sure all those people get their bows, get a year to shoot them, and, get what they paid for before the new one comes out. But man, up to my knowledge, I think now that precedent has been set in terms of like, if you want to be in the running for somebody buying a new bow, you got to have the latest and greatest, on the shelf. You got to 2023 model or 2020, every year you got to be pushing the envelope with that. So yeah, I can't think of any, maybe some real small companies like the ATA or the like Expedition, but even them, they usually have at least one flagship model every year. So
we talked a bit about bows and, grab a 7-year-old bow and it's still going to be quote unquote competitive with what's out there now. So talk more, you mentioned like accessories and quality going up. I'm also curious, like what do you see, whether this is from customers walking in or just your impressions of things? Like on one sense, a system is only as good as its weakest link, right? So take a guy who has a brand new flagship bow, super high quality, but then maybe has some like not so high quality accessories, for example.
Yeah.
Like maybe that's one example, or it's just like, where do you feel that at the end of the day for like the hunter who wants to be consistent and accurate and effective, would you say focus more on a sight or a rest or a release or your arrow setup or something besides just what bow am I shooting? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of live and die on the hill of a quality rest is pretty much my number one go-to. That's really the lifeblood of the bow. I mean, that's what's supporting your arrow. That's what's guiding your arrow. If you have one that's inconsistent or, fails on you, you're going to be in for a rough go of it, whether it's just shooting in the backyard or killing a bull or whatever that is. So I always tell people, like with anything, buy the best equipment that you can afford. There's a lot of really gimmicky stuff out there on the market. When it comes to rest specifically, what drives me crazy is a guy will walk in and, just for example, like you use, they'll buy the new Hoyt RX-7 and then they are dead set on me putting a whisker biscuit on it. And I'm like, dude, like, would you put ball tire on a Ferrari? Like, what?
Yeah.
What are we doing here? There is, and everybody has a different level of what they define accuracy as, I'm sure. But the days of pie plate accuracy at 20 yards are long gone. I mean, there's no reason with just a little bit of practice you shouldn't be able to stack, 4 out of 6 arrows in a 2-inch circle at 20 yards. So, what we push really hard is I prefer limb driven fall away rest. They're just simpler in the way that they operate. And then within that realm, Hamsky, I just never see any issues with them. I've been running them. We sold them pretty much exclusively at the bow rack. At the end of the year, at pretty much every other rest brand that we sold, we'd have a box that needed to go back for warranty work. I think I had one in 6 years come back that was a Hamsky, and a guy ran over it with a side-by-side. So, it wasn't even the rest's fault. But I would say if you let's say you had, $300 to upgrade something, I think you're much better off spending $250 of that on a really quality rest than the full $300 on, some new sight. Because at the end of the day, a sight is only going to be as accurate as you can aim with it, right? Now there are some features in terms of having the adjustability in the different axes. So, second and third axis, that will really help when you're shooting on angled and side hill shots. But I can put a fixed, like the most basic spot hog 5-pin sight there is, with the basic, black gold, like their rush sight or something like that. And for all intents and purposes, I'm going to shoot that. If I'm out at the range shooting 60 yards, I can shoot that just as accurately as I can shoot the latest, single pin slider. So I really think that the rest is a big one. And then get an arrow that is properly matched to your bow. I see it a lot where people see the number, the spine on the arrow, and you would think, not knowing anything about it, you'd look at that and think, oh, that's the weight. So like I had a guy one time come in, he had an 80 pound RX something, I think it was an RX4, with like a 30-inch draw length, and he was shooting 500 spine arrows because he thought that they were 500 grain arrows, and he heard he needed a heavy arrow for that bow.
Wet noodle in that bow.
Exactly. Yeah. It sounded like it was being dry fired every time. I mean, it was so freaking loud. And so getting an arrow that's properly matched to your bow, it's not going to take you from a, like 2-foot group to a 2-inch group at 80 yards. But when you get an arrow that's properly spined for your bow, it absorbs the bad shots a little better. Meaning what might have been, a 6-inch miss is now a 3-inch miss. So it's not this massive difference. It's the little, the little bit, whether it's competitive archery where maybe you catch the line of the spot or you're out. And in a competitive environment, if that happens, if you're out 2 or 3 times when you could have been in, that could be the difference between making the shoot off or the podium and going home empty handed. In hunting, as you're very well aware, you might 2 inches could be the difference between clipping a lung or hitting the void. So those little differences in impact can make a big difference in the outcome, whether it be target archery or hunting. So I do think that, again, quality arrows, and there's so many different arrows on the market now, it'll kind of make your head spin. But most pro shops will have a pretty good idea of, when you're set up, like, okay, here's what you're looking for. If you're going to be elk hunting, and they should ask those questions, like, what are you going to be doing? Shooting whitetail, or are you going to be shooting, do you live in Alaska or going to Alaska, or you're shooting, moose and caribou and bear and everything else? Because that will determine my arrow setup a little bit. I went to Hawaii last year and I shot a lighter arrow than I've shot in a long time, just because everybody was telling me how turned on those axis deer are, and they are. Now that arrow probably wouldn't be my first choice if I was going to Wyoming on an elk hunt. It was about 85 grains lighter than what I'd usually shoot. Now, there's been a lot of animals killed with a light arrow. There's been a lot of animals killed with a heavy arrow. That's a debate that you can go round and round for days about. But at the end of the day, whether it's light or heavy, if it's not spined properly, it's not going to be as consistent coming out of your bow.
Where do you? I've certainly seen this trend of super high FOC, heavy arrows. Where do you land on that?
I've pretty much just learned, like a lot of things in life, like I kind of live in the middle there.
Yeah.
When you look at the math, like I understand the heavy arrow in terms of like momentum and all that. The problem is and it's different for every setup, obviously, but you start getting into those ridiculously heavy setups, you sacrifice so much trajectory, which also equates to forgiveness. That if you can't hit what you're aiming at, a heavy arrow does you no good. Like whether your arrow is heavy or light, if it doesn't hit something vital, that animal is not going to die. Now, I want to believe that I'm going to have the ability to, hit my rangefinder, judge range every animal, set my sight, and aim right behind the shoulder. That's not always the case. There's so many times where, like it happens so fast. You got to rely on your instincts and say, I think that's 35. And if that animal is actually 42 and you're shooting a 665 grain arrow, you're probably just going to blow through his brisket. And now you just have a wounded animal. You're heavy, cool. You blew right through his front leg or something like that. Like that heavy arrow only benefits you so much. A really, really light arrow on the opposite spectrum there, it's like, yeah, you could center punch a rib and get very poor penetration with it. So, for your average guy, I'm usually looking at arrows, at least for out west here, if a guy wants to elk hunt, deer hunt, all that, bear, any arrow in that like 450 to like 525 range seems to be really good. But then again, that's on a sliding scale. Cause if a guy's got a 27-inch draw length shooting 60 pounds, a 550 grain arrow is really, really heavy. Whereas you got a guy like Cody from Born and Raised with a 32-inch draw length and 72 pounds, a 550 grain arrow is still going 280 feet a second for him. So, it's all about that balance, in my opinion. And then like that thing is a lot like that too. It's like there's FOC is a good thing up until a certain point. You get too heavy with it. Once your arrow slows down past a certain velocity, it's really hard for the vanes to stabilize the front of it. So
I've always, for my go-to arrow was between 415 and 440. FOC was always like 12%. Good cut on contact broadhead. And all the years I shot, I passed through like every elk I ever killed. And that's shots out to stupid far distances that I would never even attempt anymore because I don't shoot like I used to. And that just always worked for me. And then to see the argument of these super heavy arrows flying really slow, it's like, to me, it's like, okay, like you just said, ideal circumstances, yes, I range every animal, but that's not the reality. I range the elk, I come to full draw, he takes 3 steps. If that's a 55, 60 yard shot, that 600 grain arrow is dropping like a freaking rock at that distance. And yeah, there has to be speed has to be a variable you have to consider. I don't think when I see these posts online or something like that, and they just completely disregard that. And I think it's foolish. And like you said, accuracy is number one. I was listening to a podcast the other day. It was about rifles, but he was more concerned about the size and weight of the bullet than he was hitting the target at first. And to me, it was just completely backwards thinking. Like, no, the most important thing is hitting where you're aiming, and then let's work backwards from there. Because if you can't hit where the vitals, who the hell cares? Unless you're freaking, shooting a freaking, rocket launcher or something where it's going to die regardless. It's got like, you got to hit where you're aiming at. So that is number one. And then, work backwards.
And then I think what a lot of people don't realize too is how important, at least a decent tune on your bow is, because if that arrow is hitting an animal sideways, if that animal's standing 90 degrees, dude, and your arrow's hitting at a 15 or 25 degree angle to that, the transfer, there's a huge loss in the transfer of energy. Wayne used to always make the analogy. He'd say, like, you've seen those pictures after a tornado goes through and there's pieces of hay like stuck through a telephone post. It's because that piece of straw was going 300 miles an hour, but going perfectly straight. You could put a drinking straw through your hand if it was going fast enough and hit at a perfectly, straight angle. So I think a lot of guys that have issues with whether they want to blame it on the broadhead or the arrow weight, I'll bet you if you put their bow through paper, they're probably kicking significantly right, left, high, low. And that makes a really, really big difference. I used to watch that Cody Robbins guy, killed all those big mule deer up in like Alberta or wherever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember him.
Yeah, and it's just so funny because I mean he's this like renowned hunter, and he shoots this little. No offense to him, but he shoots this little like diamond bow setup with a whisker biscuit and mechanical broadheads, and I mean he's shooting these deer at like 15 or 20 yards and getting like 4 inches of penetration, and then you watch on as slow-mo's the shots, and it's, I mean, that arrow is flying damn near sideways when it hits that animal. So it's like, well, yeah, of course you're not getting any penetration, dude. Like, the side of the shaft is slapping the shoulder when it goes through. Like, so I think there's a lot of broadhead and arrow performance comes down to at least a decent tune on the bow. Obviously we pride ourselves in really making sure that it's pretty much as good as we can get it in terms of, the arrow or the bow sending the arrow straight. And then it's just up to the shooter to put it in the right spot. But yeah, you'll lose a ton of energy and penetration if that arrow is not hitting somewhat straight. So
is there any new tuning methods out there, or what's your kind of go-to steps to get a guy dialed in?
Yeah. There's most of the methods aren't new. There are certainly some that are becoming a lot more popular and more well-known just with, internet and the YouTube and all that. Our steps to the shop are always going to be, first and foremost, make sure the guy's fitted properly, right? Work on his grip. A lot of the tuning I do comes down to working with the person as much as the bow, because, if you're just death gripping that bow and turning that handle real hard, there's no amount of tuning I can do that's going to make that arrow come out straight. So once we get their grip set, their anchor point good, and, they're not just punching the release like it owes them money. We always just start with paper. So, I like to ideally, like, your arrow flight is worst at about 6 yards. Like, that's where it's going to be kicking the hardest. So on days where we don't have maybe a ton of people in the shop, I'll back us up 4 or 5 yards from the paper and tune at that distance. For 99% of the people out there, you get a true bullet hole through paper with a fletched shaft at that distance. They're going to have great broadhead flight. They're going to have obviously good field point flight. And everything should be pretty gravy. The bear shaft tuning and stuff, that's something that was really, really popular in target archery for a long time. You'll get different opinions on it, but I will tell you that it will show you a lot about your setup, in terms of your like arrow spine and all that. Even if you can get a bullet hole with a bear shaft at the same distance as your flet shaft, and then you go back to 20 yards, and let's say for a right-handed shooter, your shaft is impacting or kicking way tail right. That shows me that, we're a little stiff on the spine. It's the opposite of that. We're a little bit weak on the spine. But it's one of those methods where it's not going to take you from a 10-inch group to a half-inch group. What it will do is eliminate that one flyer, kind of, some guys, and that shot felt better than it was. And it's like, yeah, well, maybe, sometimes if the spine isn't quite right, no matter how good a shot you're executing, the dynamics of the way that arrow's kicking off the rest and flexing during flight and recovering out of the bow will affect the point of impact with some inconsistencies. The hard part with bear shaft tuning is that it takes a pretty experienced shooter to get any consistency when you're actually shooting it through paper. It takes so little difference from shot to shot to influence the way that bear shaft is going to come out of the bow that, when I have guys that come in the shop and they want to do that, I make them shoot at least 3 shots with that bear shaft to make sure we're getting the same hole every time. Because if we're not, then we're just going to be chasing our tail the whole day. And I also think with guys doing it at home, I get a ton of questions on my YouTube channel about tuning, probably the number one thing. And to me, your time for 95% of the guys out there, your time is much better spent practicing than knock tuning every single arrow and, spending 4 hours trying to get a perfect bear shaft tune. It's like, once you fletch that thing, it's incredible how much vanes actually stabilize an arrow. I just don't know that many people that are going to see a giant difference. I think a lot of people think that pros have this, pro shooters have this like secret tuning method that they're not telling anybody about. And that's what lets them shoot these incredible groups at distance. Their secret is they practice their ass off. They shoot 300 arrows a day. That's their secret. Levi Morgan could pick up a little Bear Cruiser from Sportsman's Warehouse and outshoot 95% of the people with a $3,000 setup. So that's kind of my take with tuning stuff.
It's good. It's all that you just said relates back to what I mentioned of how I look back at my archery journey experience, whatever, like the deep dive I took, and how I look at that differently now, partially in terms of my deep dive with firearms, because it's the same thing with like guys who obsess with reloading and fine tuning stuff on that perspective and going like, I want to get my group from, a half a minute down to 0.3 and all that, like chasing their tail and all that's involved. And it's like, dude, don't do that. Like spend that time actually just shooting from a field position or what have you. Assuming, we're talking about hunters versus like someone who's shooting bench rest or F class, of course. But I came to realize that in my own journey with reloading and accuracy and precision on the rifle side. And it made me realize, man, I wasted a lot of time when I did the same thing with archery of just chasing quote unquote perfection that ultimately didn't matter. Like flat out didn't matter. Like good enough is good enough and better isn't always better, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I have a guy that's been coming in the shop recently who he's newer to it. And while I appreciate the views, I had to tell him, I was like, you need to stop watching my videos right now, man. I was like, you're crazy. I was like, this is, your level. Like, if you want my help right now, like you're better off buying a lesson and spending an hour, with me working on form. At the end of the day, form conquers all. None of that tuning stuff will matter if you cannot be consistent. You look at some of the scores shot over the years at some of these tournaments and whatnot. Even back in like the late 90s, early 2000s, when tuning was a thing, but it was kind of the motto of just like, well, yeah, just, set the arrow level and just shoot it. Like Paige Pierce talks about that all the time, how on her target setups, it is not a perfect bullet hole. Like we're bow with field points. Now it's not a hunting setup, but with field points, like for her, she starts with a bullet hole through paper, and then she goes out and plays with some bear shaft stuff. And then she starts what she calls group tuning, which is where essentially you're just moving your rest, micro adjusting your rest, a couple clicks left, couple clicks right, couple clicks up, couple clicks down. And of course that's going to change your point of impact a little bit, but she's just looking at where that bow and that setup groups the best. And very rarely does that end up being a perfect bullet hole. And that drives some people crazy. They're like, well, why are we even doing this? And it's like, you just need to understand the concept of it and why. But, the broadhead, it's pretty imperative that arrow's coming out straight, or with the fixed blade, those blades are going to catch wind and play in the opposite direction. So
that was my go-to, final confirmation. I would just grab the nastiest crap broadhead that I could find, like an old Muzzy or something, and just shoot at 70 yards and see where it's grouping to my field points and adjust from there. And then, like you said, it was frequent that going back to paper wasn't a perfect bullet hole anymore, but I didn't care.
Yeah.
Like if I was getting like pure, nice laser like flight with a crap fixed blade broadhead on there, obviously had to spin true, but just, a lot of surface area, those blades are grabbing a lot of wind. If I can still get good flight with that, then everything else is gravy.
Yep, absolutely.
What have you seen with releases? Because to me, this is I don't know. I feel like go back a dozen years, and to me, at that point, like I got into handheld releases, both thumb and hinge, and it was like, man, I don't feel like there's many guys doing this hunting. And then now, anecdotally, again, feel like I'm staying up to date on all the trends, but definitely way more guys are using handhelds. Is that the case? And do you think that's helpful for hunters, or just I know it's all opinion, but
yeah, so it's absolutely the case that you're seeing it. It's so much more prevalent in the hunting world than it has been in the past. I shot, obviously handhelds for target for years. I mean, going back pretty much as far as I can remember. I think the reason you're seeing it more now is with the advent of YouTube. You have a lot of these guys who are professional shooters like Levi Morgan, Chris B, a lot of these guys that they don't want to go back and forth between releases. They train so much with one. That's what they're comfortable with. So they hunt with, basically what they compete with. And so people see that. And I don't know why, but for a long time, handhelds were considered like, oh, you never want to hunt with those. They're too noisy. They're not connected to you, blah, blah, blah. But then you see guys being successful with it. And a lot of guys go, oh, I want to try that. The thing with a handheld, and this is kind of a progressing scale here, but from like an index to a thumb button, let's say, in my opinion, yes, it is easier to teach somebody how to kind of pull through the shot or at least control the shot until it breaks on its own with a thumb button. The flip side of that is that if you don't do it correctly, it's not as forgiving. Like the point of impact or your miss on target is generally bigger. And that just comes down to, with an index, even if I punch that trigger, as long as I keep my bow arm in the shot, the only thing moving is that finger. It's just that index finger moving. So it's pretty easy to keep everything else still during that process. With a thumb button, what I see a lot of times is that whole hand kind of flinches and comes like up and away from the face or the jaw, which then pulls your front arm. For a right-handed shooter, that's going to usually cause like a low left miss. Or they just, their whole front arm, back arm, everything jumps. So I think shot correctly, and in terms of learning what a quote surprise shot feels like, which I don't really like that term because it's not really a surprise. Like it's coming. You control the whole process.
I'm shooting my bow.
Yeah, you just don't decide the exact like moment that shot fires. But I think it is easier to do. The problem is, I think in a hunting scenario, not every deer is going to stand there or bull's going to stand there, let you settle the pin, go through your entire shot process, and take 5 or 6 seconds to get an arrow loose. There are times, especially like on the coast range here in Oregon, I mean, it's so thick that sometimes you got a herd moving through. You got to stop a bull between 2 trees, get a pin on him, and just bury one in him. And, you have very little time to do it. Now, in that scenario, I think an index is going to be a lot more forgiving, because like I said, if you have to rush your shot process a little bit, or you're not to a level where you can speed up and slow down your shot process with a thumb button, which, let's face it, most people are not, generally the result is a lot worse on target. With a hinge, I love shooting a hinge for target. I don't know how people shoot them for hunting. That's the least, if you force that is the least forgiving shot in archery. It's the cleanest, best shot when done correctly. But man, if you just roll through a hinge and command it, it's a big miss usually. And so for me, especially with adrenaline going and everything, I shoot a hinge a lot in target. I'm not comfortable hunting with one. I know there's a lot of people that do and seem to do just fine with it. I mean, my buddy Wyatt Seabright, that guy is an absolute killer. I think he's shot his last like 5 animals with a hinge, and he said he really, really likes it. For me, I know myself, and I know in that scenario, like I would just feel more confident having a little more control over what happens, I think the biggest downside to a lot of the thumb releases, there's no way to connect them to a wrist strap. And like the first year I hunted with mine, because I've hunted with one the last 3 seasons now, and the first year, oh my God, it was just like a panic every time I was like, oh, where's my release? It'd be a different pocket than it was before, or the other side of my bino harness, or you sit down for lunch and you set it next to you and a bull bugles and you get up to go, and then you're like, oh shoot, I don't have a release. Which is why guys like Dan Staten, he carries like 3 releases with him at all times, just in case that happens. Now there's a lot of them that are coming out now with a wrist strap attached, and there's things you can do to kind of jerry rig one to a wrist strap. But I mean, going back to what you were originally saying, there is certainly a large influx of hunters moving to a handheld, and I don't think it's all individually based. I don't think as a whole that's a bad thing, but there may be guys that they're doing it because that's what they see Chris B do or Levi Morgan do, and it's like, well, you're not a pro shooter yet, bud. Like, maybe spend a little more time working with it before you just decide, hey, this is the best. Try different things and see what you're more accurate in a non perfectly controlled environment.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, whether you hunt with one or not, I think is a very personal decision. I do feel, at least just, and this is again very based on my experience, I feel almost everyone should at least shoot one at some point, like for a period of time. I mean, I shot just an index for years, and it wasn't till I started shooting with a handheld, both a hinge and a thumb, that I was like, when I felt the quote unquote surprise shot, which again, I get where you're coming from on that term, but that's what everybody says. I never felt proper shot execution until I, understood it from a handheld release perspective. And then it helped me go, oh, this is what it's supposed to feel like. And now I can take that and train with it and ingrain myself with that and translate it better to an index. But also, as you said, like you can force it with an index. And I fully agree. It's been my experience with you when you try and force it, even with the thumb button, because I do prefer to run mine heavy. It goes bad when it goes bad.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think everybody should learn how to shoot a hinge at some point, because learning how to shoot a hinge correctly makes every release better.
Yep.
When you learn that, kind of that push pull, and I mean, everybody's got a little different method on how they like to, operate that, but it gives you like you said, it gives you that feeling of this is what it's supposed to feel like when the shot truly just breaks on its own. And learning how to control that process. Like I know Joel Turner talks a lot about that. That's his whole thing is predicated on, controlling every process from start to finish on that, whether it's a button or a, index or a hinge. And that's the biggest thing is, being able to fight off that little voice in your head that's like, shoot it, and just being able to stick with the process,
So you talked earlier about kind of accuracy. Your channel's called Inside Out Precision. That word precision is in there. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the average hunter who wants to, whether it's extend his range or just for his own confidence, like shrink his groups even at a closer range, and you kind of hinted at this, like a lot of times it's not necessarily the gear, it is form, it is shot execution, etc. For a guy who maybe doesn't have a great pro shop to check his setup, or a guy who, can't get to a coach or what have you, like I guess the guy who wants to get better, but not just chase gear, what would you recommend what can he do if he doesn't, again, like have a great pro shop or a coach or what have you?
Right. So one thing that with YouTube these days, I mean, there's a lot of channels out there that might mess you up more than make you better. But I think you look at, channels like John Dudley, Chris B doesn't do a lot of stuff with like shooting form. He's mostly gear related. But finding somebody who has a proven track record of, making people more successful. And I understand, like you said, without access to a coach, you're going to be kind of doing stuff on your own online. But the fundamentals of the shot. So, I mean, grip, anchor point, and release execution. If you can get those three things down consistently, even if your draw length might not be absolutely perfect or what, someone would consider perfect, if you can get those things down consistently, you're going to have pretty good results. I would say if you're in an area where, there's some 3D shoots, if they hold like a state 3D or a state indoor tournament, I mean, every state's going to have one. What I used to do when I was a kid, I'd go to like Reading, these national tournaments, and I would go out to the practice range and I would just watch these pros shoot. In fact, I didn't have cell phone cameras back then, but I'd take my little digital camera and I remember this so clearly. I took a picture of Jesse Broadwater at full draw, and then I literally printed that out and put it on my mirror in my room and would just draw my bow back and try to make myself look like he did at full draw, and go, I can't get my arm out that far. I think I need a little bit longer draw length. And that might be going to the extreme, but if you can find someone on the range, it's pretty easy watch and tell who kind of the top dogs are when they're out there shooting. What I found in the sport is everybody is very, very willing to help. Like pros don't have this, like God complex where, it's not like basketball where pro basketball players, they don't want to be bothered with, anybody. Like they just want to do their thing. The pros are out there shooting with all the amateurs. And usually if you ask them to watch you shoot a couple times, they can give you great tips. And I don't mean this has to be like, top tier level pro, but every shop is going to usually have a couple shop shooters that are really good shooters. They may not be winning Vegas every year, but I mean, they know what they're doing with a bow. So just asking for advice there. Like I said, YouTube is such a valuable resource. You just want to read the comment section, make sure that people are actually, getting something out of it. I don't ever name names, but I've definitely there's a couple channels where, I watch it and I'm like, I wonder if people are actually doing this and having success. And I read through the comment section and they're not like bashing, but they're like, so I've been trying this and I'm actually getting worse. Like, and it's like, yeah, that's not really going to work. No, that's not to say that, like a lot of times when I'm coaching somebody and they've got, especially target panic stuff, we start going through the process. I tell them, I'm like, hey, things might get worse before they get better, but in the long run, this is going to benefit you. And then I think just understanding that nothing in this sport happens overnight. Like there's not that magical fix that it's all muscle memory and repetition. Right. So, there is no just, at least in my opinion, I still have yet to find something that's just that like magical, like bing, light bulb goes off and all of a sudden you're shooting, 2-inch groups at 60 yards. It's like a lot of these things, they take time to learn. They take time for your body to commit it to muscle memory and the subconscious and all that. And so if you are fortunate enough to find somebody who's telling you to work on a certain aspect, don't do it for, 10 arrows and just think you're good all of a sudden. It's like, just understand it's going to take a little bit of time to really get driven home,
Yeah, that's good stuff. It is, even again, thinking through when I first started shooting, like if I was starting now, between just the number of resources that are out there, like you said, YouTube channels from well-respected people and what have you, but even just, this goes back to what you said about Broadwater, the fact that I could shoot right now and not only take pictures, but like have slow-mo video to really see my shot execution and what I'm doing with my grip and if my anchor point's moving or anything like that, like that alone is just a huge resource that I didn't have when I started shooting. That would be so helpful right now.
Yeah. Oh, it's incredible. I mean, iPhone cameras are ridiculous. And I will still do that sometimes where, I don't know, if I've had a little break from shooting, it's like, man, something's just not feeling right. Or, it's like, yeah, take a picture. It's like, oh yeah, my back elbow is a little higher than I usually have it or whatever that is. So yeah, that's actually a really good tip too. If you've got somebody like when you're watching these guys, you kind of know what it's supposed to look like. And so then if you have a wife or a girlfriend or a brother or whoever, or a tripod, film yourself shooting and it can be pretty easy to tell. Okay, my front shoulder is way higher than theirs, or my, I'm death gripping the release or the front handle or something like that. Because a lot of times you think you're doing something right, and then you actually see yourself do it, and you're like, wow, I'm not doing it right. It's kind of like people who think they're great at dancing and watch themselves dance. Oh God, what am I doing? Yeah, that's a very good tip.
Bouncing back to gear, you had when you were talking about the importance of a rest in the system, and had some pretty strong feelings on like, hey, Hamsky's generally very good, and that's not to say everything else is trash by any means, but hey, Hamsky's very good. Do you have kind of like, whether it's one or like, hey, here's kind of like a top 2 or 3 recommendations on any other category? Because it is overwhelming, like you said earlier. There's so many arrows, so many releases, so many sights, etc. Again, from you wanting to be one, more independent, but 2, with your history, not only as a shooter, but just seeing so many setups and working in shops and all that stuff. I'm just like, would love your perspective on some of the other brands or products or stuff that you just tend to really see a lot of good luck with.
Yeah. So kind of going through the accessories on a bow. So like starting with the rest, I think, Hamskea would be my top. They've got a wide range of price points there. They're all extremely functional, bulletproof rests. This is limb driven. After that, I think AAE makes a pretty good rest. Vapor Trail, it seems like maybe we just got a bad run of them for a little while during COVID there. We had a couple little issues, but they've seemed to be pretty solid over the years. On the cable driven side of things, I will say QAD is still probably top dog there. Cable driven rests in general, just they don't support the arrow as long. So from a technician standpoint, when I'm tuning a bow, I have to make more dramatic adjustments to the bow to achieve the same difference in tune, because the rest does not influence the arrow as long. So, if I'm moving the rest, I have to move the rest further. So let's say, just for ease of numbers, I've got a 1/2 inch tear. I have to move the rest further right or left on a cable driven than I do on a limb driven, because it does not support and influence the arrow as long. But those are all good brands. Sights are a huge one. I mean, there's so many different sights on the market. I think in terms of just durability, Spot Hog takes the cake. I mean, you can practically tow your boat with that thing if you needed to. They're extremely well made. They're great customer service. They are a little heavier with that extra durability. It doesn't come for free. There is going to be a little bit of weight there. Black Gold is a very, very close second, in my opinion. They got a great pin. They've got all the adjustments that you want in terms of, the axes and they've got so many different, head and base combinations that you can make and make it single pin, 2-pin, 3-pin, 5-pin, whatever you want to make it. They're a phenomenal sight. Excel, they're hard to get. I shoot the Landslide. I love it because it's really, really light. They've been a target sight company for ages. I mean, they're hands down the most popular target sight you see. And so they kind of took that same precision minded approach to the hunting sights that they make. So just, really, really good machining on them, really solid micro adjustable clicks, no slopping, anything like that. They are like, I'm a little more cautious with my bow. Like I'm a little more, aware of where I'm setting it, and I'm not just tossing it down when I'm, about to sit down for lunch or something. Because with it being lighter, there's more potential for it to, come out of axis or out of whack a little bit if it gets hit hard enough. Those are, option sights are really nice too. Dan Evans, he makes a great sight. Any of the big reputable brands, really, it's hard to go wrong with. They all have lifetime warranties. I haven't seen one where, they're charging an arm and a leg for it and it's just an absolute piece of garbage. So those are some great brands. And then arrows, oh my God, you can go on for days, but Victory, Black Eagle, Easton, they're all phenomenal shafts. I will say I like the component system. If you're going to use the components that come with the arrows, that's one area that Easton kind of lacks, especially in like their 4mm shafts. But you can also retrofit different, insert outsert systems from other arrows onto them. They're all, their high-end shafts are all phenomenal arrows. If you're doing it from home, like building your own stuff, one thing that's nice is that Victory does, they spine align all their arrows. Now, how accurate exactly that label is to the spine, I guess that's kind of up for debate. I will say at the ATA show, they were showing us on the little RAM tester there. Most of them were within about 1/8 of an inch of where the true spine actually was. So it's at least a really good starting point for you. But gosh, they're all really good shafts. One thing I think a lot of people don't understand is like Victory is owned by Mitsubishi, and Mitsubishi is also like one of the largest carbon suppliers in the world. So a lot of those brands buy their carbon from Victory. Obviously being owned by Mitsubishi, Mitsubishi makes Formula One race car frames. They make golf club shafts, fishing rods, fly rods, all sorts of stuff. So their knowledge of the dynamics of carbon is really good. You can imagine the difference in money spent on the flex, or at least, the testing of the flex of golf club shafts versus arrow shafts. It's probably, 100-fold. So they have a set of data points that they can refer to with some of the other things they make that I think aid them in building a really, really tough and quality arrow shaft. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I shoot, a Victory Rip TKO any better than I shoot like an Easton Axis. They're both great arrows. I would be a little bit wary of some of these companies where they're just like, hey, send us your specs and we'll just build you an arrow. A lot of those guys are getting shafts from companies that didn't quite make the quality cut, or whether it be, Black Eagle or Victory or Sirius or whatever. A lot of them are kind of taking the discarded shafts and then using those in their build. But man, lots of good stuff out there. It really does come down to kind of personal preference and then just shooting it.
What are you personally hunting with?
So this year I'm running the Matthews, the Phase 4 33. I shot the V3X last year and loved it. And the Phase 4, it's that bow just a little bit quieter. For me, it's just comfortable. It aims like a rock. I'm really confident with it. I run a Excel landslide sight. I run a 3-pin slider. So when I'm hunting, I've usually got those pins set at 25, 40, 50. Pretty much lets me cover everything from 20 to 50 without having to move my sight if I don't have the time. What else I got? I got the Hamsky Epsilon, which is their integrated rest. So it sits right behind the riser, which allows me to suck up my quiver right under the limb, which just helps with, obviously throw your arrows on there. It's going to change the balance a little bit, but it's not as drastic as when your quiver's sitting out there 3 or 4 inches. And then I don't run their Matthews integrated stabilizers. I run the Conquest Archery. That's actually the same company. Well, they're owned by Black Eagle. Honestly, a stabilizer is a stabilizer at the end of the day, as long as it's a lightweight piece of carbon with some weight at the end. In the short bars, they're all going to hold the same,
I love that you said that. Like, that was always people get so hung up on stabilizers. Like, it's a piece of carbon with a weight on the end of it. Like,
yeah. Exactly. When you get into the target bars, like, 30+ inch bar, especially with how much weight guys are running on these days, then sometimes it can make sense to spring for that, really high modulus, like incredibly stiff carbon, just so that the end of that bar settles down quicker. But when you got a 10-inch piece of carbon, that thing is stiff no matter what you do. There's you can't get that thing to flex. So, it comes down to, some have a little more dampening qualities than other, but most bows are so freaking smooth now that, you just don't see that big a difference from the stabilizer. So, I run a 10-inch front bar, 6-inch back bar, which ends up being more like 8, which that's kind of something newer. Last year was the first year I hunted with that. I just shoot with one year round, and I was just like, I'm just going to give it a try. And honestly, at first I was kind of regretting it. Like, we were in Wyoming last year, and I was just, you get very spatially aware of your equipment, and then you throw this thing that sticks out 5 or 6 inches on the side of your bow. And I was just constantly like doinking it on logs, or like, my release would slap it or something like that. So once I kind of figured out how I needed to carry my bow to not sound like an idiot moving through the woods, it was fine. But, that's all personal preference. I know a lot of guys that do and don't shoot a back bar. So
how about arrow broadhead combo?
So right now I'm running last year, I shot Easton forever. I changed it up last year. I shot those Black Eagle X impacts. And then when I got up to G4, which is where I'm working now up here, we had never carried Victory at the bow rack, and I'd heard a lot of good things, so I decided to give them a try. So far they've been great. So I shoot it's the Rip TKO, so it's a 5mm shaft. I run a 75 grain like insert, and then just 100 grain head. So for my specs, because I got a pretty long draw length, and that puts me in that about 14% FOC. The arrow's 472 grains. It's just a really good combination, it seems like, of speed, but still enough knockdown power with it. I've run a Q80 Exodus forever. For broadheads, I've had great luck on the animals I've shot with them. So last year I shot those Grim Reapers, the Pro 3s. So it's the only mechanical I've ever shot. I've seen so many horror stories with mechanicals over the years, at least on elk. But Wayne down at the bow rack, he's been shooting them for the last, gosh, I don't even know, probably 4 years now, ever since they became legal in Oregon. And he shot them at everything. I mean, elk, deer, bear, I mean, you name it. And he's had incredible luck with them. So I did give him a go last year. I had great luck with him. I killed 3 deer with them. Now I didn't have any questionable shots with them, but it was crazy. I mean, it's like the holes that those things put through, just the body language of the animal after they're hit is totally different than with any fixed blade I've shot. It's like they just like hunch up, kind of stumble 15, 20 yards, stand around and just fall over dead. Like there's just the amount of devastation those things do going through something is pretty impressive. So I don't know. I've got a couple in my quiver. We'll see if I shoot one at a bull or not.
You said which model of Grim Reaper was that?
That was the Pro 3 mechanical.
Okay. Gotcha.
They're just different in the way that their blade retention system and everything. Every other mechanical relies on essentially the blades hitting the hide to open them. So there's a pretty big loss of the transfer of energy there. The Grim Reapers, there's a little, the blades clip in with there's a spring in the ferrule and the blades clip in. So there's no rubber band or O-ring or anything that's going to, cut loose in your quiver. And then the tip, if you look at the tip, they extend like a half-inch past where the blades stop. And so when that tip strikes, that spring compresses up against the ferrule of the broadhead and deploys the blades. So by the time the blades get to the hide, they're actually fully deployed. So there's not nearly as much of a loss in transfer of energy. And they're just, they're really tough. Like Wayne shot one through a propane can 2 or 3 times before it lost the blade, which for a mechanical is crazy. So they seem to be pretty awesome. I know because we weren't able to shoot them until 2019 in Oregon. And so when they were becoming, when it was coming down the pipe that they were going to be legalized, he spent a lot of time on the phone talking to everybody he knows around the country. Lots of guys in Texas where they're shooting 60, 70 animals a year off these ranches. They have tried and or had clients try every broadhead under the sun, and that name kept coming up, like Grim Reaper. It's the only one we'll allow them to shoot. So that's what we ended up going with, and so far the results have been pretty awesome. So,
well, I know this has been all over the place, which I fully anticipated and is honestly what I wanted. And so I do appreciate the time and perspective. Before we let you go, just want to make sure that guys can get in touch with you or check out your videos or know where you're at in terms of the new shop and all that stuff. So give us the rundown.
Yeah. So if you have any bow work or anything needed done, you can call me at G4 Archery. It's in North Plains, Oregon. We work on equipment all the time that guys send in. In terms of my personal page, it's called Inside Out Precision, and that's our YouTube channel. Instagram is inside_out_precision. And we try to do at least one video per week. With the move up here lately, that hasn't been quite as consistent, but now that we've got the house, we're settled in. I got a little more free time to start focusing on the videos again. But there's a ton of videos on there. I think there's over 200 already. So you got a long time in front of the computer before you're going to get through them all. So
nice, man. Well, dude, really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Yeah, it was great chatting with you guys. Good luck this season.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Kellen, thanks for the time. Listeners, as you heard, go check out Kellen's YouTube channel. There's a link in the show description for that, or maybe even give him a call at G4 Outdoors if you want some help and assistance from him on any bow tuning or bow work. As always, guys, thank you for tuning in. If you have any feedback, questions, comments, suggestions, anything like that for us, just send an email to podcast@exomountaingear.com. And finally, if you haven't already, hit subscribe or follow in your podcast app so that you receive future episodes automatically, and we'll talk to you soon.